Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. On this 296th episode of the podcast, we are talking about the three flies that I use to figure out what mountain trout are doing. The three flies I use to figure out what mountain trout are doing. So before I get into the meat of this topic, and this is, to be fair, a topic I've talked about kind of in bits and pieces, but I've never devoted an entire article or an entire podcast to this kind of approach that I use when I am trying to prospect for and trying to diagnose trout up in the mountains. But it's something that I've responded to people individually in emails from listeners and readers that have had questions. And like I said, I've touched on it here or there in small segments on the podcast and on the website. So I figured I would devote a full podcast to it because it is a recurring theme. And I think it's pretty applicable for most folks. So that's the first thing to get out of the way. Second thing is mountain trout. What do I mean by mountain trout? I mean usually high gradient streams, but probably skinny water. So this is the blue lining, the kind of thing that so many people enjoy doing because it is a way to combine a number of different aspects of being outdoors. You're usually hiking, you usually have solitude, you're usually getting into fish that are, by and large, ready to play ball. Because they live in these environments, they have to be pretty opportunistic when they feed. But that said, the whole thesis of today's podcast is really wrapped around the idea that these fish, although they might be easy some times of the year to get into, to truly master getting to the biggest fish and the most fish does require some work. And there may be times and there may be streams where you really have to go through your fly box and go through your presentation and approach technique to really dial in what these fish are feeding on, even if they are backcountry wild fish that haven't seen another angler in a long time. So all that to say, this is the three fly technique that I like to use when it comes to this situation. Another caveat to throw in there is that these are all dry flies. I like catching mountain trout on streamers. I have lots of podcast articles about that. I will use nymphs from time to time if the situation really forces me to, but by and large, I'm going to be fishing dry flies 75% of the time and streamers 23% of the time, and what's that left with? 2%? 2% of the time fishing nymphs, and that's probably even being generous. I know there's some people that absolutely love nymphing the pocket water on small streams. I personally am going to save that for places where it's much more productive and almost necessitates using nymphs. When I'm up on those high mountain streams, I like fishing dry flies, and especially in the heart of summer, that's what I'm going to be doing. So that's the three flies I'm talking about today are all dry flies. And the whole premise behind this is that fish are going to be feeding off of silhouette and presentation more than color. And really, size factors into the issue of silhouette. So I'm going for silhouette and presentation over color. So my favorite fly to start with is the humpy. Now, I know I just said color doesn't matter, but I like yellow for the reason that softer, lighter colors create a more gentle profile on the surface of the water. So what this effectively does by using a yellow humpy or maybe an orange, but definitely those colors over like a dark red or even a chartreuse, I like using those softer color like a yellow because what it provides you is a little bit of a nebulous profile when viewed from the underside. So that lighter color isn't going to create a bulbous, dark contrast when that fish is looking up, especially when the sun is out. Now, as the cloud cover comes in, that contrast is going to be much greater, and what you can see from looking up through the water column to something on the water surface is going to be much more stark. But when there is some sunlight, when it is brighter out, having that softer underbelly of that humpy creates a nice gentle profile. So what that fish is really seeing is those hackles, is that gentle underbelly and that tail. And now this provides a meaty option that does a few things. A humpy is going to land with a little bit of a splat. Now, we're talking, a size 14 or 16 humpy. So this is not a big dry fly. But the difference between a fly like this with the elk hair, with that larger body, hitting that water, even on a delicate cast, is a very different situation than a tiny little catskill dry, a little thin-bodied blueing olive, for example. And having the humpy land is going to act as a slight attraction for that fish. But when they look up, it's not going to be this giant fly. So this is going to be the first fly that I use. I like using this because I can see it well. I like using it because it does take advantage of the opportunistic nature of a lot of these fish in these small mountain streams. I like to use it because it floats like a cork. And so these three reasons are why I like throwing that humpy first, even if I see caddisflies buzzing around, if I see stoneflies buzzing around, if I see mayflies, if I see terrestrials. In my estimation, as long as there's bugs about and around and the fish are ready to rise, that humpy is going to effectively imitate any of the things that I just said. Does it match the hatch perfectly to a flying ant? No, but approximates it well enough. Same thing can be said, stonefly, caddisfly, mayfly, really anything else that's out there. So I love starting with this fly. Generally speaking, that natural elk hair color is going to provide some contrast with those darker pools and darker runs. So this is a great place for me to start. Now, this is where I go in one of two directions. Well, first of all, three directions. One direction is just to stay put. And that is if I'm catching good fish, I'm not getting harassed by dace or fall fish or things like that, smaller, bait fish that are attacking those flies. I'm going to stick with that humpy. I'm going to continue to cast and catch fish and enjoy it, especially if I'm getting into larger trout, but I would say a wide variety of trout. If I'm catching those 6 inches all the way up to those, for a normal sized mountain stream, a 10-inch fish, 12-inch fish being an exceptional catch. If I'm catching those fish, then I'm going to stick with that fly. Now, if I am not getting any action, which is terrible, and we hate to even think about it, but it does happen, especially on pressured streams. I'm thinking of some of the streams in the White Mountains where I don't hike as far, thinking of streams in Shenandoah National Park and other places in the Shenandoahs and even the Southern Appalachians where it's closer to main trailheads. Even situations where I've been out in the Rockies, where I'm kind of hopping out of the car and making a couple casts. If I'm close to where fish are getting pressure, or if the water is a little skinnier or a little lower, then I will switch it up to my second fly, which is kind of my step down, and that is a parachute Adams. So notice a few things about the parachute Adams. The parachute Adams is different enough from a traditional Adams fly in a couple of different ways. One, you still get that high visibility that you were enjoying as you were fishing that humpy. Because the parachute Adams has that post, now you can see that as it is cascading over a waterfall, as it's going through a ripple. But this is going to be a much more delicate silhouette. The body of that parachute Adams, because it is only a finely dubbed body as opposed to a larger, thicker dub body with that casing over it. I don't know if that's the right terminology actually for the back of a humpy, but you know what I mean. From that elk hair, it's going to be a much more delicate pattern, and it's going to ride more flush because it doesn't have that buoyant material in the body. So you're going to get a little bit more of a subtle profile, and it's going to be sitting more flush with the water, but you're still going to get the benefits of that post for visibility's sake, and then from the hackle being splayed out sideways, you're still going to get a little bit more of a splayed out wing and hackle profile of that fly on the surface of the water, giving you a little bit more of a bold silhouette. Very few times that I can remember on most of the small mountain streams I fished have I had to go away from a parachute style fly because I have felt like it was presenting too much of a profile for these fish. It's not that they get so selective and so persnickety that they're going to say, nope, I want that traditional done with definitely with wings, right? But they're usually okay with that parachute. But this becomes a great option for fish that are a little bit more pressured, water that's a little bit more skinny, and maybe even fish that are being more selective. And this does happen in these mountain trout situations, especially with larger fish. It might seem counterintuitive. Why wouldn't that larger fish go after that humpy? Well, whereas you'll see maybe the 3 or 4, let's say 6-inch fish that are attacking anything that lands on the surface of the water. They're hitting seed pods, they are hitting water striders, they are hitting flower petals, they are hitting just bubbles that are floating down the water. You will more often see the larger fish feed more like a fish in a normal freestone stream or in a spring creek or somewhere like that, where they're being a little bit more selective and they're eyeing what's coming over. And truth be told, a parachute Adams is going to represent the mayflies and some of the smaller other insects that are on the stream a lot more closely than a humpy will. So although a lot of these fish will aggressively attack a humpy or another attractor dry that's like it, having that smaller silhouette and that more subtle presentation of something like a parachute Adams provides those fish that are being selective with something that looks a little bit less intimidating and chunky as it's floating down. So in those situations where you have selective fish, fish are not striking that humpy, or you're having a fish or in skinny water that doesn't want that splash or that plop, then going to the parachute Adams is my number 2 go-to fly when I'm having to step it down. But what about the other way? Well, there may be some situations where I go from that size 14 humpy, not to that size 14 Adams, but I go in a different direction, and that is to like a size 14 stimulator, or maybe a size 12 stimulator. And that is for a few reasons. One, the water is high and fast, and my humpy is getting submerged all too often, and I want something that has a little bit more buoyancy and more float. That is going to come from that stimulator, which has more hackle. I'm able to grease it up quite a bit, and it's got that bigger hair wing, and it's going to float very, very well. So that's one reason why. Second reason why, I'm catching every 4-inch minnow in the entire stream on the humpy. If that's the case, and I really want to cut down on the small trout or the small bait fish that I am catching, I will go up to that stimulator, and now it's a lot more of a mouthful for those little fish to take, let alone hook themselves on. So that's where I will jump up to the stimulator. Other reasons is, again, like I said, if I'm only catching small trout, I want to target bigger fish. Other reasons why I will fish a stimulator, if I have to make a longer cast. And why would a stimulator be a better bet on a longer cast? There may be times where I'm going to have to do a couple of mends, and similarly from a buoyance perspective, but also from a drag and water resistance perspective, having that stimulator on there will not pull that fly under if I have to make a few mends that are across a couple of different currents. Maybe I'm casting to an eddy that's on the other side of the river, or it's not going to, when there is some drag, it's going to skate across the top of the water as opposed to glide across the top of the water, and which is a much more natural movement. I mean, honestly, if you think about a humpy, especially if you have to fish a little bit, its belly is going to be on the water. And the difference of a wake of a fly like that as it gets pulled across the water versus something like a stimulator, which has a palmered hackle around the body, that hackle that goes all the way from behind the wing all the way to the tail. And I know people tie them differently, but this is, generally speaking, what I look for in a good stimulator. Sometimes it's more like 2/3 of the body. But all that to say is that fly is sitting on that surface tension primarily on its hackle, not its hackle and its body. So a stimulator is like its hackle and its tail, generally speaking. And that fly being pulled across the surface of the water if I'm having to make mends, or if it's a really hard cast and I'm only getting a very, very short presentation on a smaller pocket that's really far away from me because of the current or because of the currents between me and it, having that fly skate across the water on its hackles is much more preferable, much more natural than a fly that's going to slide on its belly. And so that would be another situation where I would switch to something like a stimulator. So once again, switching to it if I want something more buoyant, switching to it if I have to make some more difficult mends or even skate the fly. And then thirdly, if I really want to target big fish or if I want to eliminate the small fish that are going after my humpy. So there you have it. That is the most basic kind of breakdown of my 3-fly mountain trout dry fly approach. And I've used this approach all up and down the East Coast. I've used it in the Midwest. I've used it in the Rocky Mountains, and I have done so to success. For you might pick 3 different flies. You may very well pick, I'm trying to think, how do you pick against the humpy? But you could pick some other attractor dry that's kind of more moderate profile, and then you pick something like a blue wing olive, or a little Griffith's gnat or something like that for your smaller fly, your step down fly, and then for your step up fly, any big bushy fly. I mean, I even know guys that a chubby Chernobyl, a big foam ant becomes their big fly, where if they are wanting to only target those big fish and they don't want something that's going to sink at all, that's what they're going to use. And I think it's a great idea. I just prefer the overall benefits of using something like a palmered dry fly when am stepping up to a bigger, more chunky fly. But this effectively does a few things. One, it gets you in front of the fish that you want to catch. Two, it takes away some of those variables that you don't want to mess with. A fly that's sinking, small fish attacking it, so on and so forth. So this is one way to do it. It is not the only way to do it, but it's the way that I do it. And I find by and large, I'm able to stick with my humpy, most of the time. I've already thrown out some weird percentages in this podcast episode, so I'm not going to say how often, but I would say maybe 2 out of every 3 trips, I'm able to stick with that humpy almost the entire time. And when I do deviate, it's because I'm switching over to a streamer because of a really, really deep hole or an undercut bank or something like that. And even in those cases, I usually do make my first cast with that humpy to see if that will, pull a trout up from the depths. And you can also kind of, you can do a few other things, to be honest with you. If you want to make this a one fly technique, then you can cast that humpy aggressively. We don't often talk about casting dry flies so that they land with a splash or a plop, but that's a really effective tool and a way to make a fly present much bigger than it actually is. Similarly, you can lube them up with a lot of floatant. You can use a combination of desiccant and floatant. Use the floatant that's liquid as well as the crystals, and you can get that fly to sit on its hackles and be a very, very delicate presentation. As long as you pop it off the water without sliding it through, you can make a number of casts before you have to reapply that. And now that exact same fly that you could cast with a big loud plop, you can now cast very, very delicately, and it's going to sit hackles and tail on the water, and you're not going to have a heavy profile or silhouette anymore. It's going to be a much more subtle and finesse approach. So there's other ways you can go about this based upon your presentation, just beyond the fly itself. But those are my 3 flies. If you have 3 flies that you have some sort of plan or scheme that you use, I'd love to hear about it. If you have 2 flies that you like to use, then that'd be great too. But honestly, what this means for me is that my mountain trout box is a whole bunch of humpies in a couple sizes, a whole bunch of parachute Adams in a couple sizes. And again, usually that's going to be like 14, 16 for the Adams, like 12, 14, 16 with the humpy, and then some 10, 12, 14 stimulators. And half dozen each of those that I have at all times, and I feel like I'm good to go. And then there's a few other random patterns. I've got 3 or 4 small streamers. I maybe have 3 or 4 small nymphs, and then maybe a couple terrestrials just in case. But by and large, I don't even turn to those things. But a nice, simple fly box that forces you to fish presentation over pattern. You can do a lot more damage. You can get out in front of a lot more fish by altering your presentation from cast to cast, as opposed to retying flies every few casts because you don't think you have it totally dialed in. And if you force yourself to work on presentation, then you can actually make your fly box work for you as opposed to the other way around. So just a few thoughts. Certainly, I like the order of this, but it isn't meant to be rigid. I mean, if there's some sort of hatch going on, if there's yellow Sallies, flitting around, I'll go into my fly box, I'll leave in the car, pull out a couple of yellow Sally patterns, and go after it with those, those little yellow caddis flies, and just absolutely enjoy it. Stoneflies. I'm not so tied to this that I'm not going to do what needs to be done when there's fish in front of me that are feeding in a certain way. But it's a nice way to just utilize the things that are confidence flies and confidence presentations that will adapt to any and all situations and circumstances. Let me know what you think. I'm always interested to hear. This week on Casting Across, the first article is called 400 Fly Shops. 400 fly shops? Well, that's actually out of date. I think at now, let me pull up my spreadsheet real fast. We are at 401 fly shops. There's a couple others that have been added to my list in the meantime. But this means that there is now 400 fly shops on the Casting Across Fly Shop directory, or the Fly Shop box, as I call it. See if yours is on there. That's Monday's article, and you can go on there, and I have added a map that you can click on. When you click on the map, it takes you to that state's listing, and you can go check out all the fly shops that are in that state. So hopefully this is a good resource for you, and hopefully it sends people towards fly shops for spending, but also all the other benefits that come from fly shops. Wednesday's article was called Debate Unsettled, Waterproof Fly Fishing Packs. So I came across an article called Fly Fishing Gear, Settling the Debate. Is a waterproof bag worth the extra cost? So that's 3 titles in one title, right? What it really is a review of a Sims pack in Men's Journal, which is all fine and good. But the author made the case for using a waterproof fly fishing pack. I made the case for not using a waterproof fly fishing pack. Let me caveat that. I like having waterproof fly fishing packs, but I don't think that they are the solution to everyone's angling. In fact, I think for most people, they are overkill, unnecessary, and a hindrance. So you can find out my 3 reasons why they are unnecessary and a hindrance and whatever else I said on this article, Debate Unsettled, Waterproof Fly Fishing Packs. It's Wednesday's article, the week that this podcast is dropping. This week's recommendation on the podcast is actually a 2-parter, all right? It is a 2-part recommendation, and the first part is a book, and it is the National Audubon Society Field Guide to North American Birds. Now, this is a 2-edition book. There's an Eastern region and a Western region, so get whichever book is appropriate to you and peruse it. And then once you have done that, then you download the Merlin Bird ID app from Cornell Lab. So in conjunction, you flip through the National Audubon Society Field Guide when you're at home, and you get yourself familiar with the birds that are around you, where you fish and things like that. And then, if you are unable to have a photographic memory of the birds that you saw in that field guide when you were at home, you use the Merlin app to ID birds as you are out fishing and hiking and mowing the lawn, whatever that may be. For what purpose? Well, I'm sure I could stretch it and figure out a reason why this is going to improve your fly fishing. But more important than that, it is simply going to expand your appreciation of the outdoors, and you may catch 2 or 3 species of fish, but you may ID 15 or 20 species of bird, and that adds something to your time on the water. So once again, the 2 things are the National Audubon Society Field Guide to North American Birds. There's multiple editions based on where you live, and then the app that is called Merlin ID, Merlin Bird ID, which is put out by the Cornell Lab. And again, not going to necessarily help you catch more fish, but it will, if this is your kind of thing, expand your appreciation and experience when you are outdoors. Links for both of those will be on this podcast show notes over at castingacross.com. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast app, and then rate the podcast in iTunes and in Spotify. Then head over to castingacross.com for 3 posts of the week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.